Imagine a Monday morning unlike any that has come before. The time is 08:30 a.m. in New York, the opening bell for the bond market. High above the streets of Lower Manhattan, inside the glass monoliths of finance, thousands of high-frequency trading algorithms lie in wait, poised to execute billions of orders in microseconds. Usually, the screens flicker with the comforting green of stability. But today, the screens do not flicker. They freeze, and then they turn a violent uniform red. There is no terrorist bombing, no hypersonic missiles are streaking across the Pacific, no armies are crossing a physical border. This attack is far more devastating, yet entirely invisible to the naked eye. On global electronic boards, the US 10-year Treasury yield, the benchmark against which every financial asset on Earth is priced, suddenly violently detaches from reality. It spikes from 4.2% to 6%, then 8% in a span of 15 minutes. This is a black swan event that no risk model on Wall Street had factored in. Why? Because no one believed that the bedrock of the global financial system, the asset considered the most risk-free in existence, could be subjected to a coordinated mass sell-off. Welcome to the darkest scenario in the playbooks of economic strategists, Project Sandman. In the shadows of the corridors of power, from Beijing to Moscow, from Riyadh to Brasilia, a plan has been whispered about for years. It is not a conventional military treaty. It is a clandestine economic pact between over 100 nations, spearheaded by the BRICS bloc, aimed at executing a simple but lethal maneuver: the synchronized dumping of US Treasury bonds. To understand the sheer horror of this scenario, we must view the macroeconomic chessboard with the cold detachment of a forensic pathologist. The modern financial world is built entirely on faith in the US dollar. Since the Bretton Woods Agreement and the subsequent birth of the Petrodollar system in the 1970s, the US has held an exorbitant privilege. Washington could print money to consume the world's goods, and the world was essentially forced to reinvest those dollars back into US public debt, treasury bonds, to keep their own currency stable and to purchase oil. It was a perfect loop. The US exported inflation, the world exported tangible value. But this mechanism requires two things to survive: liquidity and unwavering demand for US debt. In recent years, that fragile equilibrium has fractured. US national debt has surged past $34 trillion. The annual budget deficit is at alarmingly unsustainable levels, requiring the US Treasury to issue trillions in new bonds every year just to keep the lights on. Who will buy this debt? For decades, the answer was China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia. But recent data reveals a tectonic shift. China has ruthlessly slashed its holdings of US debt from over $1.1 trillion to under $800 billion. Saudi Arabia has openly declared a willingness to trade oil in currencies other than the USD, effectively ending the monopoly of the petrodollar. Project Sandman is not merely about these nations stopping their purchases. It is the scenario where they simultaneously hit the sell button. If the BRICS Plus alliance, now controlling over 40% of the world's population and roughly 30% of global GDP, decides to repatriate their reserves and dump trillions in US paper debt all at once, the bond market effectively evaporates. When bonds are dumped, their prices crash and their yields skyrocket. If the yield on US debt spikes, interest rates globally, from home mortgages to auto loans to corporate credit lines, will go vertical. The cost of capital would become so expensive that it would induce immediate cardiac arrest in the US economy. Washington insiders refer to this as the financial nuclear option. It draws no blood on a battlefield, yet it would wipe out the savings of millions, implode pension funds, and force the dollar to revert to its intrinsic value, a promissory note with no guarantor. But why now? Why would major powers risk destroying a system they rely on? The answer lies deep within a recent earth-shattering geopolitical precedent: the freezing of $300 billion in Russian foreign reserves by the US and EU via the SWIFT system. That single action sent a chilling message to the entire global South. Your sovereign wealth is not safe if you do not obey Western rules. And so, the board has been reset. The pawns have crossed the river. Project Sandman is no longer a conspiracy theory on fringe forums. It is happening in real time. camouflaged under polite diplomatic terms like reserve diversification and local currency settlement. Make no mistake, this is a war, and the first shot has already been fired, not with gunpowder.
The chaotic red lines on the charts are merely symptoms. To diagnose the disease, we must shut off the noise of the mainstream financial press. Turn on CNBC or Bloomberg during a liquidity crisis, and you will hear a cacophony of excuses: supply chain disruptions, transitory inflation, or perhaps unexpected geopolitical tension. They will point to a specific dictator, a specific virus, or a specific policy error. They are lying to you, or perhaps more dangerously, they are missing the forest for the trees. The surface reason for the decline of the dollar's hegemony is often painted as economic cycle management. We are told that emerging markets are selling dollars merely to defend their own struggling currencies against a hawkish Federal Reserve. While mathematically true in the short term, this explanation is structurally dishonest. It ignores the hidden financial agenda that has been unfolding since the 2008 financial crisis and accelerated at warp speed post-2022. The reality is that the Global South isn't just selling assets to balance books, they are de-risking from a weaponized system. For 50 years, the global financial system operated on a premise of neutrality. The US dollar was the utility, the plumbing of global trade. Like water or electricity, it was assumed that if you paid for the service, you got the utility, regardless of your politics. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, was the neutral messaging system that facilitated this. But that neutrality was an illusion. The hidden agenda revealed itself fully when Washington decided that the dollar was no longer just a medium of exchange, but a tool of foreign policy, a kinetic weapon. By levying sanctions on countries like Iran, Venezuela, and eventually a nuclear superpower like Russia, the U.S. demonstrated that it could turn the lights off for any nation that crossed a geopolitical red line. This created a key man risk for the entire world. If you are the president of Brazil, South Africa, or Indonesia, you have to ask yourself a terrifying question. What if we disagree with Washington on a crucial issue next year? Will our assets vanish too? This fear is the fuel for Project Sandman. The agenda of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now the expanded members, including Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE, is not necessarily to destroy the dollar out of malice. It is to build a fire exit in a burning building. They are creating a parallel financial infrastructure, a shadow Bretton Woods. Look at the data. It is not subtle. In 2023 alone, global central banks bought a record 1,037 tons of gold. This was the second highest annual purchase in history, only trailing 2022. Who were the buyers? Primarily China, Poland, and Singapore. Why gold? Because gold has no counterparty risk. It cannot be frozen by a decree from the US Treasury. It cannot be hacked. It cannot be sanctioned via SWIFT. It is the only financial asset that is not someone else's liability. Furthermore, bilateral trade agreements are now aggressively bypassing the dollar. China and Brazil have struck a deal to trade in yuan and reais. India is purchasing Russian oil in dirhams and rupees. The Petrodollar, the system where oil was exclusively sold in USD, is effectively dead on arrival for nearly 20% of the global oil market. The hidden agenda of the West was to use financial dominance to enforce global order without military intervention. The unintended consequence was that they incentivized the rest of the world to create a system where that dominance no longer matters. We are witnessing the end of one world, one currency. The facade of globalization is cracking, revealing a fractured world where money is now divided by ideology. The chessboard has split in two. And while the West was busy focusing on ESG scores and quarter-over-quarter stock growth, the East was busy buying physical assets and building the infrastructure for a post-dollar world. The selling of treasuries is not a market trade. It is a declaration of independence. To believe that the US dollar is immortal is to ignore the graveyard of history. Every empire believes its sun will never set, right up until the moment the twilight begins. To understand the mechanics of Project Sandman, we do not need a crystal ball. We simply need a history book opened to the chapter on the British Empire. 100 years ago, the British pound sterling was the master of the world. It was as good as gold. It financed global trade, settled debts from Bombay to Buenos Aires, and was the bedrock of the banking system. If you had suggested to a London banker in 1920 that the pound would lose its reserve status within a generation, you would have been laughed out of the room. But currency hegemony is not lost in a day. It is lost in a series of desperate gasps. The most chilling parallel to our current moment occurred in 1956 during the Suez crisis. Britain, France, and Israel launched a military operation to seize the Suez Canal from Egypt. Militarily, they were winning, but financially, they were vulnerable. President Dwight Eisenhower, furious at the intervention, did not send troops to stop his allies. He sent a threat. He ordered the US Treasury to prepare to sell massive amounts of British pound sterling bonds held in US reserves. The message was brutal in its simplicity. Withdraw your troops, or we will crash your currency and bankrupt your economy. Britain withdrew. The pound collapsed. And in that moment, the world realized the British Empire was over. It was the first time in modern history that sovereign debt was openly weaponized to force a geopolitical outcome. Today, the roles have reversed. The United States is now the overextended empire, heavily indebted and entangled in foreign conflicts. The BRICS nations are the ones holding the debt. The Eisenhower option, the threat to dump bonds to crash a rival's economy, is now in the hands of Beijing and Riyadh. We must also look at 1971, the year of the Nixon shock. Faced with a run on gold by foreign nations, specifically France, who no longer trusted the dollar, President Richard Nixon temporarily suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He defaulted on the promise that made the dollar valuable. The result was a decade of stagflation, an oil crisis, and a 90% devaluation of the dollar against gold. But the U.S. survived 1971 because it pulled a masterstroke, the Petrodollar deal of 1974. By guaranteeing military protection to the House of Saud in exchange for pricing oil exclusively in dollars, the U.S. created artificial demand for its currency. We are now living through the unwinding of that 1974 deal. The historical cycle is undeniable. It follows a precise rhythm, famously charted by macro historians like Ray Dalio. A rising power creates a strong currency, Dutch guilder, British pound, US dollar. The power becomes dominant and overextends militarily. The power takes on too much debt to finance its dominance. The currency is debased to pay the debts. Rivals emerge, forming new alliances to bypass the debased currency. A crisis of confidence occurs, and the reserve status is lost. We are currently at stage 5, transitioning violently into stage 6. During the decline of the British pound, the shift wasn't linear. It was marked by sharp devaluations, capital controls, and sudden spikes in inflation. The guns or butter dilemma, the choice between funding a military empire or feeding the domestic population, destroyed the Roman denarius, the Spanish real, and the French livre. Today, with the U.S. spending more on interest payments for its debt, $1 trillion annualized, than on its entire defense budget, the math has become impossible. The history of the 20th century teaches us that when the math breaks, the treaties break shortly after. Project Sandman is not an anomaly. It is the historical norm. It is the inevitable immune response of the global economy against a host that has become too parasitic. The only difference this time is the speed. In the 1950s, news traveled by telegram. Today, a bond dump happens at the speed of light.
In the situation rooms of the world's superpowers, the maps on the screens have not changed, but the legends have. We are no longer witnessing a clash of ideologies, capitalism versus communism, or democracy versus autocracy. Those are narratives for the voters. For the masters of the chessboard, the conflict has distilled down to something far colder: physics versus fiction. The strategic calculus of the great powers is now defined by a race to secure the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy: food, energy, raw materials, while abandoning the top: fiat currency, financial derivatives, brand value. Let us dissect the position of the White King, the United States. Washington is trapped in the late-stage imperial nightmare known as fiscal dominance. The U.S. government must issue roughly $2 trillion in new debt annually just to maintain existing entitlements and the military-industrial complex.
With interest payments on national debt now exceeding $1 trillion per year, more than the entire defense budget, the Fed faces a binary choice. Allow interest rates to rise naturally to attract buyers, which would bankrupt the U.S. government and crash the housing market. Print money to buy its own debt, yield curve control, which triggers hyperinflation and destroys the currency. The U.S. strategy, therefore, is existential. It must force the world to continue using the dollar by any means necessary to export this inflation. Without global demand for the dollar, the U.S. standard of living collapses overnight. Across the board sits the Black King, China. Beijing's calculus is subtle. They know that an abrupt collapse of the dollar would hurt them, as they still hold roughly $770 billion in US Treasuries. If they dump them all tomorrow, the value of their own reserves evaporates. This is the financial equivalent of mutually assured destruction, MAD. However, China is playing the long game. Their strategy is the golden break. They are systematically converting their trade surpluses not into US Treasuries, but into physical commodities. They are buying gold mines in Africa, copper in South America, and lithium in Australia. China is effectively saying, we will trade our manufactured goods for your resources, but we will no longer trade them for your IOUs. They are slowly draining the liquidity from the dollar system one trade deal at a time. Then there is the rook, Russia. Russia acts as the battering ram. Having already been ejected from the Western financial system, Moscow has zero marginal cost to further disruption. Their calculus is simple: resource nationalism. By linking the ruble to gold and energy, demanding gas payments in rubles, Russia demonstrated that money is useless if it cannot buy energy. The Russia-China axis is a perfect symbiotic calculus. Russia has the resources the world needs. China has the industrial capacity to process them. Neither needs the US dollar to transact with the other. And finally, the pawns, the European Union. Europe is the tragic figure in this calculus. Devoid of cheap Russian energy and reliant on US military protection, the EU is being deindustrialized in real time. Germany, once the engine of Europe, is seeing its heavy industry migrate to the US for subsidies or China for markets. Europe's role in Project Sandman is that of the primary victim, the collateral damage that absorbs the shockwaves of the dollar's contraction. The butterfly effect here is terrifyingly direct. When Xi Jinping shakes hands with Vladimir Putin and agrees to build the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline, a retiree in Florida sees his cost of living rise. Why? Because as energy moves out of the dollar sphere, the dollar weakens. As the dollar weakens, imports to the U.S. become more expensive. The price of a gallon of milk in Chicago is directly correlated to the volume of oil traded in yuan in Shanghai. The chessboard reveals a stark reality. The U.S. is playing a game of checkers, moving pieces rapidly to put out fires: sanctions, tariffs, carrier strike groups. The BRICS nations are playing Go, surrounding the opponent's territory slowly, placing stones on the board to choke off the opponent's access to the one thing that matters: real assets. The scary part: the U.S. knows it is being encircled, and historically, when a hegemon realizes it is being economically strangled, it rarely accepts the new reality peacefully. It flips the board. The calculus suggests that a peaceful transition is mathematically impossible. The debt is too high, the trust is too low, the collision course is set.
When the first domino falls in the bond market, the public will look at the stock market tickers. But the professionals? They will be looking at something far more terrifying: the derivatives market. This is the hidden monster of the financial world. Beneath the visible surface of stocks and bonds lies a tangled web of bets, hedges, and swaps with a notional value estimated at over $1 quadrillion. That is more than 10 times the GDP of the entire world. Most of these derivatives are interest rate swaps, bets on the direction of interest rates. They were constructed during a decade of near-zero interest rates, built on the assumption that rates would move slowly, predictably, and within a narrow band. Project Sandman shatters that assumption. When the BRICS nations dump treasuries, yields don't just rise, they teleport. A move of 100 basis points, 1% in a single day, is a statistical impossibility in normal models, a 25 sigma event. But in this scenario, we could see moves of 300 or 400 basis points. The result is immediate margin call Armageddon. Major banks like JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, and HSBC, which sit at the center of this web, will suddenly face liquidity demands in the trillions. They don't have the cash. No one has the cash. The interbank lending market freezes instantly. ATMs stop working. Credit cards are declined at grocery stores, not because the technology failed, but because the banks backing the transactions no longer trust each other's solvency. The velocity of money drops to zero. This is the moment the Federal Reserve panics. They will attempt to print enough money to buy everything, every bond being dumped by China, every bad derivative bet. But unlike 2008, printing money into a supply shock doesn't save the system. It murders the currency. The dollar doesn't just lose value against the euro or the yen, which are also collapsing. It loses value against reality. We see the price of oil jump to $300 a barrel, not because oil is scarce, but because the ruler measuring it, the dollar, has shrunk. While Wall Street burns, the real tragedy unfolds thousands of miles away in the nations that are innocent bystanders to this clash of titans. This is the collateral damage. In a globalized economy, the poorest nations are usually indebted in US dollars. They borrow dollars to build roads, buy medicine, and import food. When the dollar system seizes up and interest rates explode, these nations are instantly insolvent. We saw a preview of this in Sri Lanka in 2022. Multiply that by 50. Egypt, Pakistan, Argentina, Turkey, Nigeria, entire economies will face a sudden stop. They cannot import grain. They cannot import fuel. The lights go out and the shelves go empty. This isn't just about lines on a chart, it is about calories. Modern agriculture is essentially turning oil into food via fertilizers and diesel-powered machinery. If the global south cannot access dollars to buy oil, or if the oil trade fragments into a chaotic barter system, the harvest fails. We will witness the breakdown of the just-in-time supply chain. The massive container ships that act as the conveyor belt of the global economy will sit idle at anchor, not because of a virus, but because no letter of credit can be trusted. The butterfly effect here is brutal. A decision made in a closed-door meeting in Shanghai to sell bonds results in a bread riot in Cairo and a blackout in London. The suffering will not be evenly distributed. The BRICS nations, having hoarded physical commodities, food and energy, will weather the storm. The service-based economies of the West, which rely on importing cheap goods in exchange for paper currency, will face a decline in living standards not seen since the Great Depression. So, what rises from the ashes? What is the future scenario? We are moving from a unipolar financial world, the US dollar standard, to a multipolar, fragmented system. The era of permissionless trade is over. We are entering the era of resource-backed currencies. The BRICS alliance is already prototyping the unit, a trade currency backed not by nothing, but by a basket of commodities. 40% gold, 60% distinct basket of local currencies. This marks a return to sound money. For the individual investor and the ordinary citizen, the rules of survival have changed. The 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, is dead. In a world where sovereign debt is the weapon of war, holding government bonds is return-free risk. Survival insights. Hard assets are king. If you cannot touch it, you don't own it. Physical gold and silver have historically been the only lifeboats during a currency collapse. They have no counterparty risk. Productive land, in a deglobalizing world, the ability to produce your own calories or energy is the ultimate hedge. Farmland is the new growth stock. Self-custody, whether it is crypto assets like Bitcoin, a non-state digital store of value, or physical bullion, keeping assets outside the banking system is no longer paranoia, it is prudence. The banks are the front line of this war. Do not leave your supplies on the front line. The future belongs to those who own the primary collateral: energy, food, minerals. The age of financialization, where wealth could be generated by financial engineering, is ending. The age of realpolitik economics has begun. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. The Roman Empire did not fall in a single day. It was chipped away at by inflation, by corruption, by overexpansion, until one day the Visigoths showed up at the gates and found them unlocked. Project Sandman is not the cause of the American decline, it is the accelerator. It is the realization by the rest of the world that the emperor has no clothes, and more importantly, no gold. The scary truth is not that the dollar will disappear. It will likely remain, much like the British pound remains today, a relevant but diminished currency, no longer capable of dictating the fate of the world. The transition, however, will be violent. The standard of living in the West has been artificially subsidized by the dollar's reserve status for 50 years. When that subsidy is removed, reality will hit with the force of a freight train. The chessboard is set. The pieces are moving. The grand illusion of infinite paper wealth is fading. As the lights flicker in the global casino, ask yourself one question. When the music stops and the Project Sandman protocols execute, do you hold the paper promises of a fading empire, or do you hold the tangible assets of the new world? The clock is ticking, and it is later than you think.